I listened to a clip of you on, I think it was CNN or MSNBC recently, and you were asked about Biden's comments in the Jonathan Capehart interview over the weekend and whether or not, given all that you've just described in terms of shifting political attitudes toward this conflict, whether or not he is anywhere near or in a trajectory to embracing a permanent ceasefire. And your answer suggested that you think that the fact that he's now using the word ceasefire is evidence that he's being pushed. I would argue that it's evidence that he's being pushed rhetorically and feels a political need to CYA, as they say, and cover his ass. But I don't know that I see any evidence, given all that has been said about the failure of accountability here or failure to stop any of those 100 separate weapons convoys that was reported by the Washington Post or anything like that. The fact that we're now putting, arguably, we can come back to this, American soldiers at risk by having our troops participate in the building of this pier off the coast of Gaza, that there's any substantive recognition of the desire to have a permanent ceasefire now.
Well, look, I believe that the administration needs to do more. I mean, I do think words matter. And the fact that he spent 5 minutes or a few minutes at least in the State of the Union talking about Palestinian loss of life, talking about civilians being killed, talking about the destruction of homes, talking about the need for a ceasefire and release of hostages, it matters because the rhetoric in the beginning wasn't even acknowledging that loss in narrative. So
he didn't. He called them Hamas. He doubted the numbers as Hamas talking point numbers.
In the 18 days since Hamas killed 1,400 Israelis, the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry says Israeli forces have killed over 6,000 Palestinians, including 2,700 children. You've previously asked Netanyahu to minimize civilian casualties. Do these numbers say to you that he is ignoring that message?
What they say to me is I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed.
So, and I think he's listening to people. And in a democracy, that's what's supposed to happen. I mean, he's had a lot of feedback from Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, but as you know, this is well beyond that, from the AME Church, from voters of color, from young voters, progressive voters, Jewish voters as well. And at least the language is changing. But you're right, that it has to be met with a policy change. I've proposed several. Stop protecting Netanyahu at the UN. Make sure that you're at least abstaining if you're not voting yes on the ceasefires. Make sure that you're making it clear that we're not going to continue to transfer weapons. Recognize a Palestinian state, the United States bilaterally has never done. The most the Palestinians have is observer status at the UN. Recognize them at the UN. I mean, there are concrete things that they could do. This is not just theoretical. And I think it's going to come to a actual boiling point in Rafah, because from all the accounts I've heard, Netanyahu is determined to go into Rafah. And the president, as I heard the Capehart interview, made that a red line.
What is your red line with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Do you have a red line? For instance, would invasion of Rafah, which you have urged him not to do, would that be a red line?
It is a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel. The defense of Israel is still critical. So there's no red line. I'm going to cut off all weapons so they don't have the Iron Dome to protect them. They don't have. But there's red lines that if he crosses, he cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead as a consequence of going after. There's other ways to deal with the trauma caused by Hamas.
And so then the question becomes, what is he going to do to prevent an invasion into Rafah, which would be a humanitarian catastrophe? And that is, I think, where this whole conflict is going to really come to a crystal point of decision-making beyond words.
So a couple of things on that. One, with 30,000 people dead already, I think for many it's deeply frustrating that the red line is still in front of us instead of so far behind us. You mentioned that you weren't among the cohort that immediately were calling for a ceasefire in the days and weeks after October 7th. And I understand that it is politically useful to be able to point that out because many folks felt like there was a certain amount of eye for an eye that Israel deserved after losing 1,200 people on October 7th. But others who did call for the ceasefire more quickly did so precisely because they anticipated us ending up in the place we are today. Knowing that there's a population that is 50% children from the jump, do you want to endorse an aerial bombardment that started almost immediately, where within 6 days more bombs were dropped on Gaza, a tiny area the size of a LAX air, a small city, 25 miles by 5 miles, to be specific. Then were dropped on Afghanistan in a year. And why wouldn't one immediately call for a ceasefire at that point? And then secondarily, I would say Joe Biden, yes, he said there was a red line, but immediately, like in the same sentence, without even taking a breath between saying it's a red line and continuing, he says, but I am never going to stop providing aid, military and financial aid to Israel. So what does it mean to have a red line that seems to be constructively unenforceable if you're never willing to use the leverage at your disposal to enforce it?
Well, to both of those points, the first point, I unequivocally, like many, including many on the left who called for a ceasefire earlier, unequivocally condemned Hamas's October 7th attack as a terrorist attack, condemned unequivocally the rapes, and said this was unconscionable. And I thought that the people who perpetrated that should be brought to justice, and I still do. And I thought it was perfectly legitimate to try to make sure that Hamas's military capability was diminished so that that type of an attack couldn't happen again. I did speak out even before I came out for a permanent ceasefire against the bombings of hospitals, of refugee camps, of civilians, and was on CNN and other places saying that you can't, every day that these bombs are falling in the concentration that they are, is a day when more women and children are being killed. And then it was really a conversation with my mother where she said, it's time. You really need to call for a permanent ceasefire with the release of hostages. And I thought candidly that I was probably late to the call, and it's sad to me that here we are months later, and we're still in this situation where more and more women and children and civilians are dying. And I'm hoping that we can get at least to the majority of the Democratic caucus. We've been stuck at about 60 to 65 for the last couple of months. People are willing to call for a permanent ceasefire and release the hostages, and my hope is we'll get more. On Biden, I agree with you that there has to be some consequence, and I tried to make a distinction, and we probably disagree with this, but I had no problem and have voted for Iron Dome funding and defensive weapons for Israel in the past. And I said, that someone needs to ask the president as a follow-up. Okay, Mr. President, we understand you want to supply Israel defensive weapons, but will you at least commit to stopping the offensive weapons? Because what you're supplying to them is not in defense of Iran or defense of Hezbollah. You're supplying literally the precision missiles that are being used to kill folks in Rafah. And I do think that he needs to have consequences. My sense is there would be consequences if Netanyahu defies him on Rafah, but many people will say that bear hugging Netanyahu up to this point has made it ineffectual. And I really, that's why I keep talking about Rafah. I mean, this is really an impending decision for us on what's going to happen.
I have to ask, since you mentioned it, about this question of rapes. You might be aware of a number of outlets who've done follow-up reporting on both the New York Times' December story, in which they argued that there was a widespread campaign intentional by Hamas of rape as a weapon of war. And there has been some follow-up reporting tied to the UN. It was not an investigation. She was specific that she was not given an investigative authority, but a kind of a survey done by Pramila Patton recently, which the New York Times wrote up again. Outlets like Electric Intifada, The Intercept, and The Gray Zone have followed up with what we know about allegations of rape. And as I'm sure you're aware, no alleged victims have come forward or been interviewed. They did not allow, Israel did not make any alleged witnesses available to Ms. Patton by name or in person. So far, the evidence seems to suggest only some eyewitness interviews, which have been largely discredited because of inconsistencies with their testimony, evidence that they were joking and laughing and filming videos of themselves at the time at which they were supposed to be looking at mass gang rapes. Certain corroborating evidence, like, for example, there was an allegation that some of the rape victims had been beheaded, but no beheaded women turned up. Patton's investigation actually invalidated some of the claims, like the claim that a pregnant woman had been stabbed in the stomach and raped, et cetera. And of course, there is the investigation into the trustworthiness of Zaka as a source, given a number of factors, including that one of the board members of Zaka is the Obama-era official who was discovered to be antagonizing a halal cart vendor with deeply racist, Islamophobic language on multiple occasions. So I just wanted to ask you what evidence you've seen or what evidence is persuasive to you that makes you confident about alleging that rape did, in fact, take place on October 7th.
Well, I believe that both rape and sexual assault took place and condemn it unequivocally. The main source that I have relied on is the UN report, where and Secretary General Guterres saying that there was sexual assault, there was rape, there was the use of sexual violence, which violates all humanitarian laws. And Secretary Guterres, as you know, has been such an advocate for a permanent ceasefire and for peace, and has criticized Netanyahu and the extreme right-wing government. So I think he is someone who's pretty credible and objective on this issue. And I had supported the idea of the ICJ case playing out. And so I think when an international body is taking a clear finding of facts, that should be what we go on. And our own State Department has as well. I understand some of your listeners may not believe just our State Department, but it was also the UN. And the only other thing I'd say is this is why not just acknowledge that October 7th was a horrific terrorist attack where sexual violence took place, and now we need to figure out how we get a solution and peace, but we unequivocally condemn that. It seems to me not worth arguing over that point, just like I wouldn't want to argue over the point of our women and children in Palestine dying.
Well, I think, for one, to this point about Secretary Guterres, I did a quick search. I haven't seen him say that. I have seen him say that the UN should investigate claims of sexual assault and rape, and I heartily agree with that. But as you may be aware, Israel has, up until this point, been resisting an investigation, including not allowing this most recent review, again, not an investigation by Pramila Patton, to actually allow her to have any access to alleged victims. So that's what that is. I have not seen any affirmation from Gutierrez other than saying, yes, of course, we should investigate any credible claim of sexual assault.
Well,
to your
second
point as to why the Patton report,
the
she
UN
did not
report,
investigate the UN, the recent report. So she says that was not an investigation. She was not given investigative purview. And moreover, while her report conclusively says that there is no evidence in some of the alleged instances of sexual assault that have been widely reported by the mainstream media, she was not able to provide any additional, quote, evidence of sexual assault because she was not allowed access to any of the alleged victims of sexual assault. The report also said she reviewed hundreds or thousands of bits of digital information of the images of the assault, video of the assault as it was taking place, either from GoPro cameras worn by members of Hamas or cameras that were being wielded by Israelis or members of the IDF. And nowhere in any of that video documentation, was there evidence of sexual assault. Although, to your point, there's of course evidence of brutal murders and viciousness and all kinds of ugly things. But to your second point there, the question is, why does it matter? It matters because this very specific narrative keeps getting regurgitated, it seems, every time the public opinion seems to wildly swing against what Israel is doing in Gaza. And with the leaked information that Frank Lutz, the pollster, apparently tried to nail down what kind of messaging is most effective in convincing the public to support whatever Israel does with respect to its siege on Gaza, the number one kind of framing of what happened on October 7th that engenders support and sympathy for Israel is framing it as Hamas executed sexual assaults against Israelis. And so that's why I think it's important to not be, without evidence, advancing the idea that there was, again, not just some sexual violence, which may or may not have happened, of course, but that there was, quote, this widespread and intentional Hamas-directed sexual assault that was a part of the plan on October 7th.
My reading of the report, and I haven't read all the details, but my both reading of the skimming through the report and the coverage of the report was that my understanding is that they found that there was significant evidence of sexual assault and sexual violence. At least that's how the New York Times covered it.
Yeah, that is how the New York Times framed it. And I don't blame you for being, misled. Many people are and were. But I don't want to belabor this just because the last episode we did was going through all of this evidence with a fine-tooth comb. And I encourage you to read, not just to listen to that episode, but to go to the firsthand reporting that's been done by The Intercept. I know that, these are people that you know and have worked with and you find to be very credible over there. Jeremy Scahill has been part of the reporting over The Intercept. Also, as I said, Electric Intifada and The Gray Zone, because I do think it's wrong that so many people in the public have been misled. People who genuinely do care about incidences of sexual violence, as do I, into having a skewed perception of what happened on the ground on October 7th. But I do want to move on to a slightly related issue, and I'll explain why it's related, but to this TikTok ban. Congress the House voted pretty overwhelmingly in a bipartisan fashion, although credit to a number of progressives who did not vote to support the ban. But to go ahead and ban TikTok, this is being framed as a national security issue. But there's been a lot of reporting now that individual members of Congress and the heads of certain organizations like the ADL have been kind of raising concerns about TikTok, not because of some threat from China, but because they're concerned about how prevalent pro-Palestine and Israel critical messaging is on the app. And I want you to speak to the extent to which you think that particular issue is driving this bipartisan effort to do what many folks think is a pretty authoritarian move, which is to ban an entire social media app.
Well, look, I voted no on the ban, and I've been pretty outspoken about my no vote. I believe it violates clearly the First Amendment. It's not the least restrictive means of regulation. If you want to protect people's data because you're concerned that somehow ByteDance is going to be forced to give over data to the Chinese Communist Party, then just protect people's data. Pass a privacy bill, pass a data protection bill. There are other places where our data is vulnerable, including to Meta, which actually had election interference, arguably from the Russians in 2016. So it's shocking to me that we haven't been able to pass a data privacy bill. We haven't been able to pass a Internet Bill of Rights, and then in 3 days or 4 days, we rushed to pass this TikTok ban. And second, under the Supreme Court, you have to have an alternative means of communication. There are 170 million Americans on there that are not alternative means. You can't reach the TikTok global audience or get that information just by going on Instagram or going on Facebook. And that's not me making this up. That's our constitutional test under the First Amendment. So my view is it would be a 9-0 really decision that this doesn't pass the First Amendment that we all care about. And then you got 170 million Americans, by the way, many of them older. This isn't all just Gen Z, but someone who came to my office in their 40s and 50s who are
I was going to say it's me. I'm the older American.
Well, I don't know if you're on TikTok, but
No, I'm actually too old for TikTok.
as a small business, one person said to me, he's gone from living in a truck to the penthouse, and he's built a small business around this. So people's livelihoods as well. So the bar has to be very, very high. And I don't know. I won't comment on any specific issue. What I would say is this on TikTok. I think that the speech there and the information there is a threat to the political establishment on both the left and the right, that it gives perspectives that don't make it on to mainstream media. And that is something that people find threatening. I personally view it as expanding the political conversation, and absent very specific evidence, which I have not seen, that China is somehow taking your data or my data, the Chinese Communist Party, in a specific targeted way, or absent evidence that they are mass infiltrating propaganda into the app, I don't see how we go to a ban under our First Amendment.
Yeah, I'm reminded, frankly, of a moment during the Bernie campaign, which we were obviously both a part of, where I was asked in an interview what I felt about Russian disinformation reaching Black voters with messages that the U.S. government has not been friendly politically to African Americans. And my response, which the campaign didn't love, was, well, to the extent that that's Russian disinformation, it's hard to find the lie in it. And if you want to combat it, you can address the underlying issues. You know, someone pointing out a true fact about the legacy of American politics is not exactly what I would characterize about as misinformation. And I feel the same way with whatever concerns people are raising about whether or not pro-Palestinian content is being pushed or not, which I don't think is the case. There's no evidence that that's the case. But I wanted to ask you about this because it does seem like it's difficult for Congress to do things. I think the last congressional session was rated as one of the least effective, least active in the history of Congress, or at least in a very long time. And yet it seems almost overnight there is a kind of unanimity and coming together to do something that's pretty drastic and which is not supported by anywhere close to a majority of Americans. I think there's only about 30% low 30s% of Americans who would support a TikTok ban. At the same time, you do have in a lot of different arenas what seem to be censorship or restrictions on people's ability to have opinions specifically about Israel, its politics, and Americans' relationship with Israel emerging. So it's not just this TikTok ban. And I'm not sure if you saw the leaked video recording of Jonathan Greenblatt talking about how we have a TikTok problem a few months ago.
But I also want to point out that we have a major generational problem. All the polling I've seen, ADL's polling, ICC's polling, independent polling, suggests this is not a left-right gap, folks. The issue in the United States' support for Israel is not left and right. It is young and old. And the numbers of young people who think that Hamas's, massacre was justified is shockingly and terrifyingly high. And so we really have a TikTok problem, a Gen Z problem.
It is this bill that just passed in South Dakota, which redefines anti-Semitism in a way that would exclude any comparison to between the policies being enacted against Palestinians and the horrors of the Holocaust, something that the winner of the Best Foreign Film Oscar, Jonathan Glazer, just did after he made his acceptance speech, in the course of his acceptance speech, saying, let's not repeat the past in the horrors of the Holocaust in Palestine.
Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people. Whether the victims of October the 7th in Israel or the ongoing attack on Gaza, all are victims of this dehumanization. How do we resist?
That kind of speech would be deemed anti-Semitic in the context of South Dakota, and there are 3 states, and including South Dakota, that have laws like that are percolating through their legislatures. And of course, as you're aware, very early in this conflict, the House passed a resolution to equate explicitly anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I wonder if you see a thread here and if you're concerned that there are particular restrictions on people's ability to speak, the ability to congregate and to protest the way that they've been trying to do at various universities where they've been banned. The Palestine Students for Justice have been banned at a lot of these institutions, along the lines of criticism of Israel in particular.
Well, I have been a strong proponent of freedom of speech, and that's why I asked Christopher Wray when he was before my committee to make a commitment that people won't be surveilled or targeted just because of their views on Gaza or the war in Gaza.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.